I'd flown salvage long enough to know what a dead signal sounds like. Flat carrier wave, no modulation, the kind of ping a wreck throws out for 1,000 years because nobody ever cut the power. I almost logged the long recess as exactly that and burned past it toward a paying wreck 2 systems over. Then the carrier stuttered. Twice. Evenly spaced, like a heartbeat somebody was trying to keep steady on purpose. Nobody keeps a heartbeat steady on a ship that's been dead 11 years. So I brought the Cutlin reachabout and matched drift with the thing. It had been a teaching habitat once. One of the old orbital schools the Ravener Court used to seed among its outer holdings, classrooms, a garden ring, dormitory spokes built for children who'd never see the ground their ancestors came from. When the Syndral Assembly took the throne, they hadn't bothered hunting down every drifting schoolhouse. Why would they? A school full of orphaned wards, no engines worth stripping, no weapons worth seizing. They logged it lost in the purge and moved on. Somebody inside had decided not to be lost. Docking with a wreck that size usually means cutting your way through a dead airlock, and hopping the air on the other side hasn't turned to poison. This one cycled for me on the first try, lights flickering up along the corridor in sequence, worn but working, like the habitat had been maintained out of pure refusal to let it die. The corridor smelled of recycled air and something green growing close by, which told me more than any readout could. Dead ships don't smell like gardens. I found her in the garden ring, on her knees in packed soil, coaxing a bank of hydroponic troughs back to life with hands that had clearly done it every day for 11 years. Gray-skinned, a faint sheen to it like oil on still water, wine-dark hair cut short and practical, and eyes the color of old bronze that came up to meet mine without a flicker of surprise. Behind her, arranged in a loose crescent the way you'd arrange children who'd been drilled to hold formation without knowing why, stood 11 of them. The oldest maybe 14. The youngest barely past toddling, thumb in his mouth, staring at me like I was the first new face he'd ever seen. He probably was. "You're not Syndral," she said. "Not a question, a verification." "I'm nobody's," I told her. "Salvage captain picked up your ping." "Instructor," she said, by way of introducing herself, and didn't offer more. I stayed 4 days doing what salvage men do when the wreck turns out to have people in it instead of cargo, patched her scrubbers, coaxed a dead reactor loop back to 40%, taught the older two how to read a pressure gauge so they'd stop guessing. She ran that habitat like a ship of the line, rationing charts on the wall in a hand so neat it looked printed. A rotation for who slept nearest the failing heat vent. A drill, run twice a week without fail, for what to do if a Syndral patrol ever found the signal she couldn't quite bring herself to silence, because silencing it meant no one would ever come. She didn't sleep much. I noticed that the second night found her still awake at the workbench turning a scrap of insulation into a bandage roll, and I noticed the ring on her hand, plain gray steel band, worn smooth, turned deliberately inward so the face sat hidden against her palm. A woman who works with her hands that much doesn't wear a ring by accident. She wears it because taking it off would mean admitting something was over. I didn't ask, it wasn't mine to ask. Twice I watched her run the drill she'd built for a Syndral patrol that might never come, lights cut, wards silent, and folded into a maintenance crawlspace behind the false wall of the garden ring. No sound, no light. 4 minutes by her own count before she'd call it clear. The first time she ran it for my benefit, I think, to show me exactly what I'd be dealing with if I turned out to be the wrong kind of visitor. The second time she ran it because Pell had gotten sloppy holding still, and she corrected him gently, without raising her voice, the way you correct something you can't afford to have go wrong twice. I asked her once how long she'd been running that drill. She said long enough that none of the older ones remembered a version of their lives without it. I didn't tell her I thought that was its own kind of tragedy. She knew. On the 4th night I was in the mess hall showing the 2 oldest wards how to splice a coolant line when the youngest Pell, they called him, maybe 4 years old, climbed into my lap uninvited and started playing with my hands the way small children do, turning them over, comparing them to his own. Then he found the instructor's hand instead, resting on the table beside him, and did the same thing. Small fingers, working the ring loose, turning it right side out just to see it catch the light. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet the way a held breath does, all 11 wards, one after another, following Pell's eyes down to her hand. "They're Empress," he said, delighted, like he'd found a coin in the dirt. He didn't whisper it. He was 4. He said it the way children say true things, without any sense that it was dangerous to be right. She didn't move to cover the ring. I think 11 years of moving to cover it had finally worn out, the way anything wears out if you do it enough. She just sat there, spine straight the way it had been straight every hour I'd known her, and let the silence hold. I'd heard the name once, years back, on a news feed nobody thought mattered anymore. Iset Mira Ravener, presumed dead in the purge, last seen boarding an evacuation shuttle that was never recovered. I hadn't put it together. Why would I, the woman I'd spent 4 days with, wasn't a name off a dead feed? She was the person who taught 11 orphaned children to read a gauge and hold a drill line and believe, against every reasonable expectation, that somebody would come. 11 pairs of eyes went from Pell to her hand to me, waiting, I understood later, to see if I'd change. If the man who'd spent 4 days fixing their scrubbers would suddenly start kneeling, or stammering, or looking at her like she was a title instead of a person who hadn't slept properly in over a decade. I didn't see any reason to. "Pressure's still low on line 4, I said to the older ward beside me, like nothing in the room had shifted. "Show me that splice again." It took her a second to understand I meant it. I watched it land on her face slower than the recognition had landed on the children's, not shock exactly. Something closer to permission, the kind you stop expecting after enough years of not getting it. Her hand closed around the ring, but she didn't turn it back inward. She left it facing out. "You knew," she said to me, quiet, once the children had gone back to their splice practice, and their argument over whose turn it was to check the vent. "I knew you kept a ship running better than most captains I've served under," I said. "The rest is paperwork." She almost smiled at that. It cost her something to let it show. I understood by then that everything about her cost something. The rationing, the drills. The ring turned inward for 11 years so 11 children could grow up without a target on their backs. She'd earned the right to let one thing be easy. "The Syndrel will hear a ward said my name eventually," she said. "Children talk, even good ones. Then we get you all somewhere they can't find you before that happens," I said. "Not the throne. Not yet, maybe not ever, if that's what keeps them safe. Just somewhere with a working reactor and a door that locks." "That's all you're offering, a door that locks?" "It's the only offer I've got that's worth anything," I said. "Crowns aren't my line of work." She looked at me a long moment, the bronze in her eyes catching the mess hall light, and I understood that was the whole of it. Not a court kneeling, not a fleet arriving with banners, just one salvage captain refusing to let a title change how he looked at a woman who'd kept 11 children alive on rationed water and a rotation chart. That was the recognition she'd been waiting 11 years to receive, and nobody had to bow for it to count. We left the long recess drifting empty 3 days later, its ping finally, deliberately silenced, not because no one was coming anymore, but because everyone who mattered already had. Pell wrote the whole way to the Cutland Reach on my shoulders, asking Iset if the ring meant she was a queen for real, and she told him yes once, and that it had never once been the important part. I kept the door locked for her every night after that. She never asked me to, I just did.